Wait, don't scroll past this one. I know what the topic sounds like. I know what you're expecting. This is not that video. This is one of the strangest, most undertold threads in all of human history. And the fact that it barely exists on this platform is exactly the reason we're making it. Here's the part that should bother you. Roughly half of every human who has ever lived has menstruated. Not for a decade, not for a century, for the entire span of our species, going back before agriculture, before writing, before cities. And yet, open almost any history book, and you'll find 3 chapters on siege warfare, and not one paragraph on what a woman actually did with her body on a random Tuesday while running a household, working a field, or ruling an empire. That gap is what we're closing today. We're going to Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, medieval Japan, sub-Saharan Africa, the Aztec world, and Viking-age Scandinavia. We're going to look at what women used, what their doctors believed, and some of the genuinely deranged things men wrote down about periods that somehow got treated as scientific fact for 2,000 years. Let's get into it. Start with the obvious question nobody bothered asking for most of recorded history. If menstruation is universal, why does it barely appear in the archaeological and textual record? Partly because most ancient writing was done by men, about men, for men. Partly because the objects involved, cloth, plant fiber, moss, don't preserve well over thousands of years the way a bronze sword does. And partly, frankly, because a lot of ancient scholars found the subject either too mundane or too unsettling to write about directly. What we do have is a patchwork: medical texts, religious law, the occasional traveler's account, and a surprising amount of information hiding inside myth. Let's start in Mesopotamia, because the Sumerians and Babylonians were writing things down before almost anyone else on the planet, and some of what they wrote is remarkably candid. Babylonian medical tablets, the kind kept by the Asu, their physician priests, reference menstrual irregularity as a condition worth treating rather than a mystical event to fear. There are prescriptions involving beer infused with herbs meant to regulate a delayed cycle. Beer, it turns out, was the ancient world's answer to almost everything. But Mesopotamian religion also tied menstrual blood to omens. Babylonian omen texts occasionally reference a woman's cycle timing as something diviners factored into predictions about the household or the king. It wasn't purely clinical. It sat in this strange overlap zone between medicine and prophecy that a lot of ancient science lived in. As for what women actually used day to day, we're mostly guessing based on materials available in the region. Wool was common in the northern parts of Mesopotamia. Linen, once it became widely cultivated, was common further south. Historians studying Bronze Age textile remain suspect women folded strips of cloth and secured them with a simple belt, a solution so basic and so universal that versions of it show up on nearly every continent independently. Now to Egypt, a civilization that, true to form, left behind actual paperwork on the subject. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts dealing specifically with women's health, dates to around 1800 BCE and discusses menstrual disorders alongside fertility and pregnancy concerns. Egyptian doctors treated an absent or painful period as a medical issue with medical solutions, not a curse to be endured. For daily management, the leading theory among archaeologists is that Egyptian women used softened papyrus reeds, rolled and shaped, functioning as an early absorbent material. Papyrus was cheap, abundant, and already being repurposed for everything from writing surfaces to sandals, so this tracks. Linen, Egypt's other great textile export, was also almost certainly used, given how central it was to Egyptian daily life, right down to being the material of choice for wrapping the dead. Culturally, Egypt treated menstruation with less anxiety than many civilizations that came after it. It was associated with fertility and connected, at least loosely, to the goddess Isis and to the flooding cycle of the Nile itself, a natural rhythm that gave the country its food supply. A menstruating woman in Egypt wasn't exiled from public life. She kept working, kept trading, kept existing. Compared to what's coming next, Egypt looks almost enlightened. Ancient Greece is where things get complicated, and where the gap between elite male theory and lived female reality becomes almost comedic. Aristotle wrote extensively on the female body, and his conclusion was that menstrual blood was essentially unused, unrefined semen. In his framework, men's bodies cooked blood into semen through internal heat, and women, being colder and weaker by his reasoning, failed to complete that process with menstrual blood as the leftover result. This wasn't a fringe theory some crank scribbled in a corner. It was mainstream medical thought, taught and repeated for centuries. Hippocratic writers took a more clinical approach, at least. Hippocratic texts describe menstruation as a necessary purge of excess blood and treat its absence as a warning sign requiring treatment, sometimes involving specific diets, sometimes involving what we'd now recognize as early gynecological examination. So you had one strand of Greek thought treating the body seriously and clinically, and another strand, often from the exact same intellectual tradition, confidently insisting women were biologically unfinished men. Greek philosophy, brilliant and unhinged, frequently within the same paragraph. Practically, Greek women likely used wool, an obvious choice in a region with an enormous sheep farming economy. Small wool pads or rolled plugs functioning as early internal absorbents appear in surviving medical commentary, alongside references to belts or wraps used to hold cloth in place. None of it was glamorous. All of it worked well enough to let ordinary life continue. Then there's Rome, a civilization capable of building an aqueduct system that still partially functions today, while simultaneously producing Pliny the Elder's Natural History, which reads at points like the ancient equivalent of a chain email full of nonsense. According to Pliny, contact with menstrual blood could dull the edge of a blade, curdle wine, kill bees, drive dogs into a frenzy, and even blunt the force of a hailstorm if a woman stood in a field at the right moment. Rome, apparently, believed menstruating women were walking weather systems. Obviously, actual Roman women were not treated as ambulatory natural disasters in daily life. They shopped, worshipped, ran households, and raised children through their cycles like everyone else. The likely materials were similar to Greece: wool, linen, and notably sea sponges, which were abundant in the Mediterranean, naturally absorbent, and reusable after washing. There's a frequently cited, endlessly debated line from the poet Ausonius referencing a sponge in a context some historians read as menstrual hygiene. Classicists have argued about that single reference for longer than most modern products have existed, which tells you how thin the record really is. Wealth mattered enormously here, as it did everywhere. Roman aristocratic women had access to fine linen and household labor to wash and prepare it. Poorer women, the overwhelming majority, made do with coarser cloth and whatever was on hand. That class divide runs through literally every civilization in this video, and it never fully disappears, even today. Before moving further through history, it's worth pausing on taboo, because ritual restriction shaped menstrual experience far more than any material shortage ever did. In ancient Jewish law, a menstruating woman was considered ritually impure or nida, requiring separation from certain contact and eventual purification through immersion in a mikveh. This wasn't about germs or hygiene in a modern sense. It was about a completely different category of ritual cleanliness. Hindu legal texts, including the laws of Manu, contain similarly strict guidance, restricting a menstruating woman from cooking, entering temple spaces, or touching others, with warnings aimed at men about the supposed consequences of ignoring the restriction. Zoroastrian religious texts pushed even further, describing isolation huts where menstruating women were kept apart from fire, water, and earth, the sacred elements at the core of Zoroastrian cosmology, and given restricted food during that separation. Across parts of sub-Saharan Africa and in many indigenous cultures of North America, a comparable practice existed in the form of dedicated menstrual huts or lodges, sometimes called moon lodges. The meaning attached to this varied enormously by culture. In some traditions, it reflected fear and exclusion. In others, the woman wasn't seen as unclean at all, but as spiritually charged, temporarily set apart because her power during that time was considered too potent for ordinary space. She returned from isolation with elevated status rather than diminished standing. Same basic structure, radically different meaning, depending entirely on the worldview surrounding it. Jump forward to medieval Japan, a civilization that doesn't usually make it into these conversations, but absolutely should. Shinto belief held blood in general, and menstrual blood specifically, as a source of ritual impurity called kegare. Menstruating women in some periods were barred from entering shrine grounds or approaching sacred sites, a restriction that, remarkably, persisted in certain traditional contexts well into the modern era. Historical records describe designated huts called heya, used in some rural communities for menstrual seclusion, functionally similar to the moon lodge concept found an ocean away, developed with no contact between the two cultures at all. That parallel, appearing independently on opposite sides of the planet, says something interesting about how consistently human societies reach for the same solution when faced with the same biological fact wrapped in fear. Materially, women in pre-modern Japan are believed to have used layered paper, specifically washi, a strong absorbent traditional paper, folded and held in place with cloth ties. Cotton became more available later and gradually replaced paper as trade expanded. It's a detail that surprises people, an entire absorbent technology built around a material more associated today with origami and calligraphy. Medieval Europe deserves its reputation for rough hygiene, but the reality was more layered than everyone just suffered. For most peasant and working women, free bleeding into thick wool layers and dark fabric was almost certainly standard, simply because stopping physical labor wasn't an option available to most households. Wealthier women used folded linen or wool rags, held with a belt or girdle, washed and reused repeatedly. Medically, Galenic theory, inherited and distorted from ancient Greek and Roman sources and filtered through the church, treated menstruation as the body purging excess blood, a necessary and even healthy process. A missing period wasn't good news in this framework. It was a red flag suggesting dangerous blood buildup, so physicians actively prescribed herbs meant to bring on a delayed cycle. This category of plant, called an emmenagogue, included pennyroyal, tansy, and various species of wormwood. Several of these substances genuinely do affect uterine activity, which is also why the line between menstrual regulation and early abortive practice in medieval herbal medicine is blurrier and more fascinating than most people assume. Traditional Chinese medicine took a fundamentally different philosophical approach than most of the traditions we've covered so far. Rather than treating the female body as an inferior or failed version of the male body, Chinese medical theory going back to the Han Dynasty treated menstrual health as a core diagnostic window into overall wellness, tracking the color, timing, and volume of a woman's cycle to assess broader imbalances in qi and blood flow. Materially, women used cloth pads made from cotton, or, for wealthier households, silk, secured with a woven belt, a design not far removed conceptually from a modern reusable cloth pad. Herbal formulas targeting cramping and irregular cycles were developed, refined, and passed down through generations of practitioners, some of which are still prescribed today in traditional Chinese medicine clinics. Across the Atlantic in the Aztec world, menstrual blood carried genuine cosmological weight. Aztec religious thought was deeply cyclical, tracking agricultural seasons, ritual calendars, and celestial movement with obsessive precision, and the female cycle fit naturally into that broader framework rather than sitting outside it as an anomaly. Materially, historians believe Aztec women used fibers from the magi plant, the same versatile agave relative that provided food, rope, and the alcoholic drink pulque, processed into a soft, absorbent material. Much of the deeper detail here was lost during Spanish colonization, which destroyed the majority of Aztec written and pictorial records, leaving historians working from fragments, colonial-era accounts, and comparative ethnography with surviving indigenous communities. One more stop before we zoom out. Viking-age Scandinavia. Norse sources are frustratingly thin on the topic directly, but archaeological finds of wool and moss packed in specific configurations in burial and settlement contexts have led some researchers to propose moss as a menstrual absorbent, a material that, remarkably, has genuine antimicrobial properties and was independently used for wound dressing across the same period. If true, it means Viking women may have stumbled onto a genuinely effective medical solution centuries before anyone understood the microbiology behind why it worked. Here's a detail that reliably surprises people. The first mass-produced disposable menstrual pad, a product called Lister's Towels, launched in 1888 through Johnson & Johnson. It flopped almost immediately because Victorian-era women were too embarrassed to ask a male pharmacist for it by name. Real commercial success didn't arrive until 1921, when Kotex ran an advertising campaign reframing the product as a hygiene necessity rather than a shameful personal item. Sit with that timeline for a second. Every civilization we just covered, spanning roughly 4,000 years, managed menstruation without a single disposable product. The item most of us think of as a basic necessity is barely a century old, a rounding error compared to the length of the actual history. So what does all of this actually add up to? A few things stand out once you zoom out far enough. First, women were never passive about their own biology in any era, on any continent. Every single culture we looked at developed practical, often genuinely clever material solutions using whatever was locally available, and refined those solutions across generations through observation and shared knowledge, even when that knowledge was never formally written down. Second, material scarcity was rarely the actual obstacle. Wool, linen, cotton, moss, paper, and plant fiber existed almost everywhere on the planet in some form. What varied enormously, and what actually determined a woman's quality of life during her cycle, was the cultural and religious framework wrapped around the biological fact, a society that treated menstruation as dangerous or impure restricted movement, labor, and social standing. A society that treated it as sacred or simply as ordinary biology let women continue their lives with minimal interruption. The physical tools were often nearly identical across both types of society. The lived experience was not. Third, most of what got written down came from men observing from the outside, and it shows. Pliny's list of agricultural disasters, supposedly caused by menstrual contact, tells us essentially nothing about what Roman women actually experienced day to day. It tells us what Roman men feared, misunderstood, and felt entitled to write authoritatively about anyway. The actual functional knowledge, the stuff that worked, passed between women directly and rarely made it into the historical record at all. That's a real and significant gap in what we know, and historians are still working to reconstruct it through archaeology, comparative anthropology, and closer readings of the sources that do survive. One last thing worth addressing directly: pain. Menstrual cramping is a real physiological experience, and it did not begin in the 20th century. Nearly every tradition we covered developed some response to it. Greek physicians prescribed warm compresses and wine-based remedies. Chinese medicine built entire diagnostic and herbal systems around regulating flow and easing discomfort. Medieval European herbalists reached for emmenagogic plants that, as it turns out, contain compounds with measurable effects on uterine muscle activity. Ginger, cinnamon, and fennel show up across multiple unrelated traditions as remedies, which is a strong hint that this wasn't random folklore. It was generations of women testing what worked and passing the results along, an entire body of accumulated empirical medicine operating almost completely outside the formal, male-dominated scientific record. If this is the kind of history that never made it into your textbook, that's the whole reason this channel exists. Subscribe so you catch the next one, and a like just helps more people find it. We build museums around ancient weaponry. We reconstruct battle formations down to individual troop movements. We've made documentary after documentary about kings, generals, and empires. And yet, one of the most universal biological experiences in human history, something every single generation of women on every continent has had to manage directly, barely registers as a subject worth serious attention. It isn't in most school curricula. It's a fairly recent addition to academic history departments. And it took a slightly provocative title just to get you to click on a video about it, which says something on its own about what we've collectively decided counts as real history. So next time this subject gets treated as too awkward or too minor to discuss seriously, you now have the receipts. Egyptian priestesses dealt with this. Roman senators' wives dealt with this. Viking women dealt with this. Aztec noble women dealt with this. It is, quite literally, ancient history, and it's overdue for a permanent seat at the table.